Welcome to our worship today online with North County Church. We're so glad that you've joined us today. It's a big day over at our campus at 10 o'clock. We're having our baby blessing. So our families that have had children since 2019 are going to have their children up front, and we're going to pray and ask God's blessings on both the parents and the children. So Baby Blessing Day is always a special day in the life of North County Church, and we look forward to that. If you're still worshiping with us online and not joining us at the campus, you can watch that on our Facebook Live in our congregational group. So let me just kind of say that up front, and I hope you'll do that. It's a special time in the life of not only our church, but those families as well. So some good things in store. Today I'm going to be preaching a message on seeing the unseen and fixing our eyes on the right things. And we're going to talk about discouragement and how to deal with discouragement as believers. Like probably many of the families that are represented and those who are watching this, you've probably been on a long trip with your kids in a car. Maybe, like our family did some years ago when the kids were a lot younger, maybe you've made a trip to the Grand Canyon. You know, you leave San Diego County and you go out Interstate 8 and you head to Phoenix, and it's about a 6-hour drive, and then you head about, 3 more hours up to the Grand Canyon from Phoenix, maybe a little longer than that. And along the route, you're driving through desert. You're driving through a lot of cactus and a lot of sand dunes, and it's hot outside depending upon when you go and at what time of the year. And if you've got a carload of kids, you're making your way on that long trip, and somebody has spilled their drink on the other, and somebody's invading the other's space, and there's a little bit of bickering back and forth, and there's some things that we can all get petty about, including Dad. I've been on those trips where I can get a little bit irritable, maybe a little bit grouchy about some things as the trip tends to go on and on and on. But if you're going to the Grand Canyon, you think about what's ahead, and finally, when you arrive and you pull up to that canyon and you step out and you step over to the rim and you look over and see the glory of the Grand Canyon, you're awestruck. It is breathtaking. When you see it for the first time, it literally takes your breath away. Suddenly, all those irritations, all those petty things on the trip, they just kind of fade out of your memory. They're nothing really, because you have arrived at the destination, and the journey with all of its seeming frustrations along the way was so worth it, because now you're seeing what you hadn't seen until you arrived. What we're going to talk about today is getting our eyes fixed on the unseen, on the destination, and on the spiritual realities that God is at work in us and through us, even in those times when we are tempted to get discouraged and maybe even to despair. And most of us, if not all of us, deal with discouragement at some time or another. I've been discouraged as a minister. Kind of reminds me of the story of the guy who woke up one day and looked at his wife and said, "Honey, I'm not going to church today. I'm just going to stay in bed, and I'm going to maybe pull the covers up over my head and I don't feel like going today." He said, "Nobody likes me there at the church. People criticize me there at the church. I'm just not going to do it." And she said, "Honey, I want you to get up and go to bed, or get up and go to church with me because you really need to do it." He said, "You give me 3 reasons why I should go." And she said, "Well, number 1, because God said that we should assemble in His Word. Number 2, because you need the encouragement. And number 3, because you're the preacher." Well, I'll confess to you candidly, there have been times, not many, but there have been times over the course of my years of ministry, some Sundays where I've awakened, and instead of being eager to preach, instead of being eager to go off, I've felt a little bit discouraged. And I have thought, man, I would just as soon stay home today and not go and shake hands and smile. Again, those occasions are few, but I go anyway, and I'm always glad that I did. I always go away feeling better, at least 90% of the time, than maybe when I arrive. But sometimes I and other people I know in full-time ministry deal with discouragement. And there are a number of things that can lead to discouragement. And I talk to others in ministry, and we share sometimes similar experiences. Sometimes it's the visible results of full-time ministry that can be discouraging. One Sunday, attendance is up and you think the church is growing, and the next week, the attendance is down by 50. You work with people and study with them and try to help them to become faithful disciples of Christ, and they fall away and go back into the world. That's discouraging. You sometimes, like a family on that journey to the destination, with all the kids in the car, deal with some pettiness in the life of the church. People can bring their complaints. People can let you know of the things that don't please them. I've had people kind of come into my office at times over the course of the last 35 years and just kind of dump some complaints on my desk, and then they disappear and leave, and you never see them at church again. We deal with self-doubt. We deal with maybe some insecurities about our abilities and whether or not we're being effective, or maybe we deal with some criticism that stings a bit. Church leaders get up and sometimes get discouraged. They plead for volunteers in certain areas of ministry, and very few seem to raise their hands. Sometimes they work on things and work hard on those things, only to hear people kind of express the things that weren't done right, or not done the way they thought they should have been done, or people focus on the things that were missed instead of the things that were accomplished, or they deal with people agreeing to show up who've made a commitment, who said, yes, we'll be there to some project or act of service, only to experience that they didn't follow through on the commitment that they'd made. No, ministers and church leaders sometimes deal with discouragement in the course of ministry. And none of us are alone in this. I'll bet that as I'm speaking this message today, I'm talking to people who've dealt with discouragement, who've been discouraged from time to time. Sometimes somebody at church disappoints us, says something that discourages us. Maybe you say, Kevin, we prayed about some problem in our life or our marriage or our family life, and instead of the problem being easier to deal with, it seemed to just get bigger. Or we get discouraged in parenting. We try to reach our children, and maybe they're resistant and rebellious. Maybe we're discouraged because we have succumbed to the same temptation repeatedly, and we wonder, will I ever get power over this in my life? Or we have a falling out with somebody at church. Or maybe we have faithfully carried a ministry in the life of the church and we need help, but nobody seems to come alongside and give us the help we need. Or maybe I'm talking to some folks who have aged some, and now you're at a place in life where you've come into some health problems, and maybe you don't feel as useful as you might have at another time in your particular life. And maybe you feel somewhat alone, and maybe even neglected or forgotten. Discouragement. We all deal with discouragement. And maybe sometimes we're tempted to think, maybe I should just give up. Maybe I should just throw in the towel. Maybe I'm not making a difference at all. Life here, in the realm of the seen, what we see and experience, it at times can be very disheartening. Years back, I used to tell the story, it was when I first started preaching about a bus driver in New York City. The news had reported that this New York City bus driver, he didn't return back to the station at the end of his workday, and nobody could find him. Well, it turns out that this particular city bus driver dropped off his last passenger at the end of a particular workday, and instead of heading back to the station there in New York, he headed toward Miami Beach. He just took that bus and drove south. And when he was interviewed later, it's kind of hard to hide a city bus from New York, isn't it? So when he's finally found and asked why he did that, he just said, I'm tired of the cold temperatures. I'm tired of the cranky passengers. I've got some difficult family relationships. At the end of that particular day, I was just done and I was getting away. Maybe you felt that way. Maybe you have felt like Jeremiah expressed himself in Jeremiah chapter 7. Jeremiah had been faithfully preaching God's word to God's people, and Jeremiah said, man, I want to throw in the towel, I want to quit and go into the motel business. Oh, that I had a lodging place out in the desert for travelers. I could just go there and I won't have to deal with all the things I'm dealing with in the course of preaching for you, God. As a matter of fact, he got so discouraged in Jeremiah chapter 20, he felt like the Lord had deceived him, and he was deceived. No, God had not lied to Jeremiah. Jeremiah was just seeing life. His eyes were fixed on the problems and the visible results that he could see from his preaching. His eyes were not fixed in the right place. Sometimes our discouragement is a matter of perspective. And sometimes we might feel like Jeremiah, that we're failing even in our ministry. Maybe even our message is failing. Maybe you have felt at times like the gospel itself is failing. Maybe the message isn't as good. Maybe it's not as powerful as we thought it was. We look around and what we see doesn't always seem positive. We look around and we see that the world isn't at peace any more than it was in the days of Jesus. We just have to look over at the current crisis between Israel and the Palestinians. Or we can look over at North Korea or at other hot spots in the world and we say, boy, the world just doesn't seem to have any more peace than it did 2,000 years ago. And we look at our own nation and the moral compass of our nation seems to be broken. There are rising cases now of crime and violent crime. There's racial disharmony. The sanctity of life is under assault. Sexual morality is ridiculed. There's been a coarsening of language in our culture, increasing family breakdown. And so we wonder sometimes as believers, how can we ever stem the tide? Is our message as powerful as we thought that it was? And then we see the Christian faith in many parts of the Western world starting to experience a decline. At least in our country, it's been declining over in other parts of the Western world for many years. And it seems that there are more and more Christians who are apologizing for the gospel instead of boldly proclaiming the gospel. And then you just add to that the day-to-day difficulties that come with living life. The water pump on the car breaks. We get laid off at work. Something breaks at the house and it's a major repair and it's going to cost. Life at times can be disheartening. Sometimes we feel like a football team that we read about way back in 1916. The worst college football defeat in history was in a game played between Georgia Tech and Cumberland College. Cumberland College lost 222 to nothing. Cumberland never got a first down. As a matter of fact, halfway through the first half, one of the Cumberland backs fumbled the ball. And as the ball was rolling towards his teammate, he sang to his teammate, pick it up, pick it up, pick up the ball. And his teammate looked back and said, you dropped it, you pick it up. Maybe you say, yeah, I can identify with that. Sometimes I feel like the score against me is 222 to nothing. Sometimes we can feel hopeless and powerless. So what does God speak in to such discouragement that we feel at times? And maybe you say, I'm not that discouraged. I'm not in despair. You might be at some point. Paul was there. 2 Corinthians is a letter that has an underlying theme and other themes as well, but an underlying theme of discouragement and despair. Paul speaks in 2 Corinthians about the hardships that came to him as a servant of Christ. Let me tell you what I mean. Let's look in chapter 1 at verse 8. Paul said, "We don't want you to be uninformed, brothers, about the hardships we suffered in the province of Asia. We were under great pressure, far beyond our ability to endure, so that we despaired even of life." Boy, you talk about a guy who at times perhaps didn't want to show up and didn't want to preach. He establishes the Corinthian church. He goes off and then he preaches in other places. And while in those other places, he suffers arrests. He's flogged. He's kept in prison. He suffers hardships. He's beaten and he's bloodied. And while he's doing all that, going through those experiences in the church that he has faithfully established and served, there are those who've come in and they're undermining his efforts and his credibility. They're saying, "Oh, Paul, he's nobody. He's nothing." Here Paul had gone in, established the church, and there were those who then came in and questioned his apostleship and said, he's not really even an apostle. And boy, he's big in letters, but he's not much to listen to as a preacher. So he's discouraged. He's disheartened, as you can imagine. And you wonder if Paul didn't awaken on some mornings and think, man, I don't feel like showing up and keeping up and doing this any longer. I mean, what's the point? If you're going to be faithful to God, and these are some of the results that you experience and see, why don't we just quit? Paul said there in chapter 1 at verse 8, we despaired even of life. But having said that, I don't think he ever truly considered quitting it or giving up, throwing in the towel. How do we handle discouragement when it comes? How do we handle those moments when we might even despair of life itself? Well, as we move out of a time that's been discouraging for so many and move back into a time of heightened opportunities for church activity and church service and gathering, there's been a lot of discouraging news out there. There have been a lot of people saying, oh, the churches aren't going to be as strong or as well attended as they once were. You'll find that many have kind of left the faith, moved out of the church, moved away. They've gotten comfortable not assembling with the body of Christ. There have been a lot of discouraging words pointed at what's coming for congregations. Well, what will move us from a place of discouragement to a place of joy, to a place of encouragement, and a place of strength? Well, let's look together in chapter 1 at verse 9 of 2 Corinthians. Paul speaks about the hardships he suffered in verse 8. He speaks about those challenges, those difficulties that brought him to the place where he and his co-workers even despaired of life itself. But he says this at verse 9, indeed, in our hearts, we felt the sentence of death. We felt something. But this happened that we might not rely on ourselves, but on God who raises the dead. Now, I want you to hear that for a moment. Here Paul speaks about despair, feeling the sentence of death. But God who has the power to raise the dead can bring us back to life when we're in despair and discouragement. He can give us our strength back. He can give us our vitality back when we get our eyes focused on Him. Paul says these things happened so that we might not rely on ourselves, so that we might not look at our own experiences, circumstances, our own strength that is within us, so that we might not place our confidence in those things, but rather instead rely on God who raises the dead. Paul said, He has delivered us from such a deadly peril, and He will deliver us. On Him we have set our hope that He will continue to deliver us as you help us by your prayers. Now, having read that in chapter 1, that takes us to chapter 4. So turn over a couple of chapters, and I want you to notice in 2 Corinthians chapter 4 that Paul speaks again to the temptation of discouragement. Look at verse 1 of 2 Corinthians chapter 4. He said, "Therefore, since through God's mercy we have this ministry, we do not lose heart." And if you drop down to verse 16, he says it again. We do not lose heart. Paul talks about the mercy and the goodness and the grace of God. And first he remembers how they had received their salvation, how he had received his salvation. Paul knew that he was deserving of death. He had persecuted Christians. He had shaked his fist, so to say, defiantly toward God and towards Jesus. But God, in His grace, extended to Paul the opportunity to be saved. Christ had been sacrificed for Paul, too, even though Paul had been a persecutor of the church. That overwhelmed Paul when he considered it. Paul in another place said, "By the grace of God I am what I am." But even more than that, he wasn't just saved, he was given a ministry. He was given a mission. That too was a gift of God's grace. For God to say, "Paul, I have saved you, and now I'm giving you a work to do." And this work, this ministry, it is a grace. Paul said, through God's mercy, we have this ministry. God has taken me, a sinner who was working against Him, who was hostile toward Him. He has saved me, and He has given me a purpose to wake up every day. He's given me a way to serve Him and to serve His purposes. So I have salvation as a gift, and I have this ministry as a gift. And that helps Paul keep everything in perspective. He doesn't lose heart now. This one who had once been an opponent of God knew that just as he had been an opponent, that just because there are people out there now opposing him as he preaches the gospel, just as there are those out there who resist the gospel that he preaches, just because there are people who ignore God, that doesn't say anything about the truthfulness of what he was now preaching. His own fierce opposition and now conversion told him of the power of God to change even the most obstinate, even the most persistent persecutor. So Paul is saying, since I've received salvation, and since by God's mercy He's given me a ministry, I see the possibilities and the power of the gospel. And despite these circumstances that have brought us to a place of feeling despair, we don't lose heart. And he continues with that vein of thought in chapter 4 to tell us why we should never lose heart. He was honest. He says, and he acknowledges in chapter 4, it's not just the circumstances. We have an adversary who was working against us. Notice in chapter 4 at verse 4, he said, "The God of this age has blinded the minds of unbelievers so that they cannot see the light of the gospel of the glory of Christ, who is the image of God." Paul never deceived himself. Paul said, "I know we are working against an adversary who is opposed to God, who is opposed to God's gospel, who is trying to keep people from receiving the gospel. He blinds the minds of unbelievers and makes it difficult for them to see the light of the gospel of the glory of Christ." Christians, we should always realize that yes, life does have difficult circumstances, that yes, even ministry can be difficult, but we have an adversary working against us. He's referred to as the God of this age there in chapter 4 at verse 4, and it's a reference to Satan our enemy, the accuser. He's the God, little g, of this present age, in that many submit to him in this present world. But God, our God, is the God of all eternity. He's the God who's everlasting. Satan's power, it's limited. It'll ultimately be extinguished. The New Testament teaches that Christ, or that in Christ, sin and death has been defeated. That Christ has broken the grip of Satan on mankind, but the full effect of victory is not yet complete. Read 1 Corinthians chapter 15. There's a day coming when the full effects and our being able to fully see the victory, it'll be complete. In John's gospel, Satan is referred to as the prince of this world. He influences and he blinds people to the gospel of Christ that they cannot see. And that they cannot see doesn't mean it's impossible for them to see. Sin has blinded their hearts, and Satan has tempted them to reject Christ. But Paul probably, as he writes this, remembers his initial calling, where Christ met him on that Damascus road. One place we read about it is in Acts chapter 26 at verses 17 and 18. Paul describes how Jesus spoke to him. And here's what Jesus said, kind of a section out of that text. I'd encourage you to read the whole of it. But Jesus said to Paul, Saul at that time, I will rescue you from your own people and from the Gentiles. I'm sending you to them to open their eyes and turn them from darkness to light and from the power of Satan to God. Paul, in his initial call, knew that there were people who were blinded to the gospel. Their eyes could not see. They needed their eyes to be opened by the preaching of the gospel to see the light and to see the power of God and to turn from Satan and to turn to God. So I think Paul probably recalls that as he writes what he does here in 2 Corinthians chapter 4, as he thinks about all the discouraging circumstances that led them to despair even of life, to feel the sentence of death. He said, no, in the midst of all this, we're learning to rely on God. God in his grace and mercy has given us this mission to go out and open eyes. And we expect hardship. We don't expect it to be easy. Jesus told us there would be much tribulation, much difficulty. So what Paul does in 2 Corinthians is he comes back to the teaching that God is more powerful and that the gospel and the glory of Christ is shown, the more it's shown to others, the more will come. So he urges them to keep speaking. And he keeps speaking. Down at verse 7, he said, this all-surpassing power is from God and not from us. It's from him. Down at verse 18, he said, we fix our eyes not on what is seen, but on what is unseen. So here's my encouragement to you today, brothers and sisters. Discouragement, it's often a matter of perspective. Yeah, sometimes in our circumstances, sometimes in our experience, sometimes with the results we see in this visible world, man, we can get down. We can feel knocked out. We can be even at a place with Paul where we despair of life itself and wonder how we can get up and face another day. But it's a matter of perspective. We need to fix our eyes again on the unseen realities that God is on his throne, that Jesus is at his right hand, that his Holy Spirit is in us, empowering us, that he has saved us in his grace, and he's not just saved us, but he's given us a way to serve him in the world. And the end results of all that service will not yet be seen in this particular world, but in the age to come, in the world to come. And Paul's message is you keep keeping on. You keep your eyes fixed on God. Keep your eyes fixed on the unseen. It was a balmy October afternoon in 1982. Badger Stadium in Madison, Wisconsin was packed that day with more than 60,000 die-hard University of Wisconsin supporters as they were watching their football team take on Michigan State, the Spartans. And it soon became obvious in the course of the game that MSU had the better team, and they were trouncing their opponent. So here's all these fans, and what's happening on the field is disheartening, it's discouraging. They're losing, but the odd thing was this: even though the score had become so lopsided, there were bursts of applause and shouts of joy from the Wisconsin fans. And it, of course, raised the question, how could they cheer when their team was losing as it was losing? Well, it turns out that 70 miles away, the Milwaukee Brewers were beating the St. Louis Cardinals in Game 3 of the 1982 World Series. And many of the fans who were in the stadium watching the football game on the field, they were listening to that baseball game that was being played on portable radios, and they were responding to something other than their immediate circumstances. Well, I want you to think about that. Sometimes what we see on the field in front of us is discouraging. It's disheartening, but what Paul's doing here is Paul is encouraging us to fix our eyes not on what we see, but on the unseen. And when we do that, we can rejoice even in hardships because we see Christ's great victory. We see the destination. And folks, when we arrive there, when we step out and see the glory, man, that long drive, those concerns and irritations and frustrations, they'll just start to fade into memory, or out of memory, so to say, as we're just awestruck by the glory of God. Hang in there. Be encouraged. Put your eyes on the unseen. Lift them off of what is just evident and right in front of us. The things that we see, the frustrations, the difficulties. See what God is up to. See where God is leading us. Be encouraged. If you're watching this and we can help you to be encouraged in some way, maybe you'd like to learn more about the Christian faith. Maybe you'd like to learn more about Jesus and giving your life to Him and receiving by grace that salvation and His mercy. Maybe you just like some prayers. Maybe you're feeling discouraged and you'd like others to pray for you. Email us. There's an email at the bottom of the screen. Let us know how we can help, and we'd be happy to do that. Thank you for being with us today. Stick around. We'll have a communion time in just a couple of moments after a little more praise.